It's revision session 4.2. Stalin. How did Stalin reinforce his dictatorship? 1929 to 41. First of all, the 1936 Constitution, sometimes called the Bukharin Constitution, formulated by Bukharin. It claimed to be democratic because everyone could vote for the Supreme Soviet. In reality, the Supreme Soviet was a joke. You could only vote for communist party members, and it only met for 2 weeks every year, so not a lot gets done. Really, the real power still lay with Stalin and the Politburo. Okay. Another thing about the 1936 Constitution, you know what a constitution is, by the way. A constitution is like the rule book for government. Another thing about the 1936 Constitution, it couldn't have been very democratic because OGPU, OGPU, the secret police, which later became the NKVD, they were completely beyond the Constitution. They could operate outside the Constitution, so they could arrest people without trial, hold them indefinitely, torture them, and all kinds of horrible things. Okay, so the 1936 Constitution, not very democratic at all, despite its claim to be. So we've got Bukharin in there, Supreme Soviet, OGPU, NKVD. Next thing, another way that Stalin held on to, or reinforced his dictatorship in the years 29 to 41 was through the Purges. If anything went wrong in Russia, Stalin was able to blame certain individuals. And he always made sure that he was quite tactical about who he blamed. He blamed people that were a threat to him. So some obvious targets were Kirov, Kirov. Kirov was an upcoming young Bolshevik, had been quite loyal to Stalin, recently getting a little bit too big for his boots, also Stalin thought, so he probably had him murdered. This is certainly what Khrushchev believed when Khrushchev was writing about this later in Khrushchev's life, way after the event, by the way. But Khrushchev certainly believes that Kirov was murdered on the orders of Stalin. Now, that's not necessarily the purge. That was the excuse for the purge because Stalin blamed Zinoviev and Kamenev. And it was these two rivals for political power, Stalin's rivals for political power, it was these two that Stalin had purged. Expelled from the party, put on trial, and executed for murdering Kirov. Now, there's a couple of other key words on this list. Purge, we know what purge means now, get rid of something you don't want. That's what Stalin was doing. Sadism, sadist. Was Stalin a sadist? Was he sadistic? Did he enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on people? And paranoia. Was Stalin paranoid? Arguably, yes, he was both sadistic and paranoid. So Kirov, Kamenev and Zinoviev were purged. We've also got Yagoda in there. Yagoda was the chief of the secret police. It was he who arrested he who arrested Kamenev and Zinoviev following the death of Kirov. And we've got Khrushchev in there because it's his evidence. It was Khrushchev who claimed that it was probably Stalin who had Kirov murdered in the first place. Okay. So the Purges was another way Stalin managed to reinforce his dictatorship. A further way Stalin managed to reinforce his dictatorship were through show trials. And getting rid of any other rivals or people who didn't fit in with his plan. A major group of individuals who didn't fit in with Stalin's plan were the Kulaks. Kulaks, not to be confused with gulags with G. Gulags were the horrendous Siberian work camps. But kulaks were rich farmers, wealthy farmers. They had grown rich under Lenin's new economic policy. They had employed peasant workers of their own, and they'd made quite a bit of money. And obviously this did not sit well with communism, where everybody's equal. So Stalin used this excuse to get rid of the kulaks. It also, nice link to Stalin's economic policy, it tied in with what Stalin wanted to do economically, because he was able to confiscate all that wealth that the kulaks had made, able to confiscate all their land for his collectivization program. Okay, so a nice link in there if you want to write that down. Nice link to his collectivization program. But he was able to scapegoat the Kulaks and blame them for economic trouble. So again, it's part of the Purges, being able to blame any problems that the USSR is suffering on enemies of the state. And that's exactly what the Kulaks became. They became enemies of the state. Anyone who was named as an enemy of the state was put on trial for treason. And if found guilty, as they usually were sent to gulags. Okay? Conditions in the gulags were terrible. People often died, have been worked to death in the gulags, forced to do strenuous work in mines, very unhealthy work in horrible conditions, often freezing conditions. Show trials was another way that Stalin managed to reinforce his dictatorship. The show trials, thousands of people went on trial. They were televised. Often they were televised. Viskinsky was the famous prosecutor in the original round of show trials. Viskinsky's name's in there. They were fantastic for Stalin because he got people to publicly, on TV, admit their guilt. How did he do this? Well, he threatened their families, okay? Their families were threatened. If you don't confess, yeah, it's all over for you, you're going to get executed, but if you don't confess to this publicly on TV, then we'll get your family as well. Okay, so a horrendous way of attacking his enemies. And this all rolled into the Great Terror. Okay, now what was the Great Terror? You didn't know whether you were safe. Nobody knew if they were safe or not. 12 million people were killed or sent to gulags as part of the Great Terror. You could name anybody that you wanted to. So it was about using spies, contacting the NKVD, anyone that looked at you funny, you could report them to the NKVD, and that's exactly what happened. People were shopping each other. Anybody that they didn't like, they were writing letters to the NKVD and getting them arrested. And there was a purpose to this as well for Stalin. It might seem completely psychotic to us, but if you're constantly living in fear, you are going to behave yourself. It didn't matter whether people were guilty as part of the Great Terror. It didn't matter whether they were guilty or innocent. The fact is, the effect it had on the rest of the population. Everybody behaved themselves and got their heads down and worked hard because they were terrified of becoming part of that 12 million people who were sent to the gulags. The NKVD used a network of spies to make sure that nobody stepped out of line, and just telling a joke about Stalin was enough to get you sent to a gulag. Interrogation techniques were brutal. Okay. There was also the purge of the armed forces. 75 out of 80 of the Supreme Military Council were executed. A total of 35,000 officers were shot or imprisoned, and 6 admirals of the Soviet Navy were also shot. The consequences of this were that it left the army quite weak, and it forced Stalin to build up the military very quickly. It also focused Stalin on the need for a defensive policy towards Adolf Hitler. Okay. Another way, a final way really, that Stalin managed to reinforce or strengthen his dictatorship 29 to 41 was through the cult of personality. Okay, so he created an image of himself as this kind of benevolent, caring, generous, strong leader. Uncle Joe, all the pictures of him make him look quite friendly, actually. He also used the works of artists, authors, composers to raise his profile and celebrate the USSR. So you've got famous authors like Solzhenitsyn, 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 who was criticized by Stalin for not writing nice things about the USSR, and he ended up being sent to the gulags. He wrote one of his most famous novels there, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is about a day in the life of someone who's in a gulag. So this was a man who wrote horrible things about Stalin, somehow managed to survive, but it gives you, he was victimized, he was sent to the gulags because he did that. On the other hand, you've got someone like Shostakovich, who was a composer who did celebrate the USSR and was rewarded for it. In periods he was victimized, but usually he was rewarded for it because he wrote, composed pieces of music that celebrated the USSR. So through this kind of propaganda, other kind of propaganda, posters, and the use of media like compositions and artwork and novels that Stalin agreed with, censorship effectively, Stalin was able to create this cult of personality, and that strengthened his image and his control on the country as well. So, just to recap very quickly, what kind of things have we got? How did Stalin strengthen or reinforce his dictatorship? First of all, the constitution, and the Bukharin constitution, claimed to be democratic, but actually wasn't. The NKVD stood outside it. Remember, the Supreme Soviet was a complete joke, etc. Another one was the Purges. He purged any enemies that he didn't, that challenged him, basically. Good examples here are Kirov, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Bukharin himself eventually became a victim of the purges, as did Yagoda himself, chief of the secret police, was eventually swallowed by that machine as well. They've got the gulags, the horrible conditions in there, the show trials. This is a separate thing, the show trials. Viskinsky was the prosecutor that got everyone to admit to treason, even though they were probably innocent of treason. The NKVD I've mentioned, interrogation techniques, sending people to gulags. The Kulaks were a group of people who were got rid of, and that strengthened Stalin because it gave him the ability to scapegoat a huge group of people and confiscate their lands and use it for collectivization. The purge of the army was another one, and finally the cult of personality. These are all things that you can talk about if you're asked a question about how Stalin strengthened his hold on power in 1929 to 41. Okay.